I want us to continue our discussion of the morning because this question about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart comes up so often. And trying to understand what is happening in the text, I think, is extremely important in order to identify what we are supposed to learn, what we are supposed to gain. I want to remind you of a principle from the morning, and that is this, that in the text that we're reading here, God does, in fact, decide in His own mercy whom He will honor or grant or work with in a physical way. That's what we talked about this morning. Physically, it is a fact. God raised up Pharaoh. He didn't raise up this guy. He raised up that guy. And that's who He did. He chose Isaac. He chose Jacob. But in that choice, physically, it did not affect them spiritually. So they still had a chance, all of them, to be used by God in different ways. Just because you're not chosen for this does not mean that somebody else has been lowered. But God does have mercy, and He wants us to have that mercy, spiritually speaking. And He wants you to be saved. He does not intend or create a way for you to be lost. He does not cause you to be lost. 2 Peter 3, verse 9. But He wishes, He wants, He would like for you to be saved. 1 Timothy 2 and verse 4. So this passage then uses the situation with Pharaoh in order to discuss the other side. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will harden whom I will. I want you to think with me, just open your Bibles to the book of Exodus, and we're going to talk about what is going on in this event with the Pharaoh before, or Moses before him. I want to look, first of all, what's going on. Here is what's happening. Let's be sure we get some things in order. Look at chapter 3, verse 19. Here is what God says. I am sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go. No, not even by a mighty hand. Here is the plan that God knew about all along. This is what's going on. Before He even began talking to the Pharaoh, He's talking to Moses and He's saying, here's what's going to happen. I am sure that He will not let you go. Look at chapter 4. If you look at chapter 4, it is an interesting chapter because there Moses is talking with God. And Moses he's a reluctant servant anyway. He doesn't believe that he has the ability to speak for God. And so God's going to get Aaron to go with him. And he said, I don't even know your name. And God said, I'll tell you my name, and then you can tell them. And he says, well, what if they don't listen to me? And God said, all right, here's what we're going to do. They won't listen. Here's what you do. You have a rod, a walking stick, a cane, a staff. He said, you take that rod and you throw it on the ground. And he did it right there, and it turned into a serpent. And God said, now pick that cane up, that staff, that rod. And when he did, he picked it up. I think it's fascinating. He picked it up by the tail. That's smart. That's smart. I mean, if he really trusted God, you think he'd grab him by the head? Well, I don't know. I tell you, I don't know he didn't know what was coming. I wasn't going to pick it up by the head. So he reached there and got it by the tail, turned back into a rod. God said, see, you can do that when you get to Pharaoh. And then he says, I'll tell you something else. Take your hand, put it inside your garment. And he pulled it out and he said, look, it's all leprosy. It's leprous. Put it back in. Pull it out. Gone. He said, see, you'll be okay, Moses. This is my plan for you. You just go in there and you deal with him. You bring these signs. Look at chapter 7. Starting with verse 3. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart and multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. But Pharaoh will not heed you, so that I may lay my hand on Egypt and bring my armies and my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great judgments. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring out the children of Israel from among them. The end of the story is right here. God said, here's what I'm doing. I am proclaiming to Egypt that I am the Lord God. That was the plan. Going in, before anything ever happened. See, right here, we have not gotten to Pharaoh yet. This is all just to Moses. This is God telling Moses, you need to go do this because I have a plan, and I am going to be recognized as the God of heaven, and all of Egypt is going to know it. That's the plan going in. Okay. Now, let's go back to this hardening idea. Here's what's fascinating. The idea of Pharaoh's heart being hardened, that phraseology happens 12 or 13 times in these chapters. Now, here's what is fascinating, at least to me, about it. As we begin looking at it after Moses encounters Pharaoh. And what I want you to notice is that as Moses encounters Pharaoh, look at chapter 7 and verse 13. After he threw down his rod and picked it back up, the text says, Pharaoh's heart grew hard. He did not heed them, as the Lord had said. All the way from chapter 7 through the first 4 plagues, every time the phraseology, or whenever he is talking about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, it always says, the first 4 plagues, Pharaoh hardened his heart, or his heart was hardened, or it grew hard. Now look at chapter 9, verse 12. In the 6th plague, so I should have said the first 5 instead of the first 4. In the 6th plague, God finally says, the Lord hardened his heart. In the 6th plague, verse 12, chapter 9. And from that point on, in chapters 9 and 10 and 11, right on up until he pulled them out of Egypt, it says the Lord hardened his heart. Except for at the end of the 7th plague, chapter 9, verse 34. When Pharaoh saw that the rain, the hail, the thunder had ceased, he sinned yet more. He hardened his heart. Verse 35, the heart of Pharaoh was hardened. So I think it is interesting that as this event unfolds, we have God telling Moses what his overall plan is. Then we find Pharaoh's heart being hardened by himself. In other words, as God sends his plagues through the first 5, Pharaoh is hardening his heart. Starting in the 6th plague, God hardens his heart. So that's how this thing unfolds. Now, there may be something significant there. I think there is. But I want you to notice that's sort of the timeline. That's sort of how it works. So the question then is this: is God allowing his heart to be hardened and then taking over and hardening his heart? Well, that's a fascinating thing. So what I want to do, I want to go back and I want to look at some principles with you that we can learn, identify some facts, some things that happen, and maybe gain some insight into how can we answer this question about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. No matter what we discuss, no matter what we disagree or agree, here is a fact. Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Fact number 2, the phraseology is, at times, the Lord hardened his heart. Okay, so how are we going to deal with that? Well, I want you to back up to chapter 3. And we're going to deal with some things in chapter 3 about starting there anyway. But before that, before I mention the chapter 3, verse 19, unless I missed it, now you can look at it for yourself to see. But you remember that God said, I gave you 2 signs. He put them in his hand. He said, here are your signs for Pharaoh. The rod on the ground and the hand inside the garment. There is no record, as far as I can tell, that Moses did that one. Is it there and I just missed it? You can look and see. Isn't that fascinating? God said, I've given you these signs, and here's what I want you to do. He did the first one, not a problem. He did not do the second one. I don't know what we're supposed to gain from that. Did he do it and it just wasn't recorded? I guess that's a possibility. But it seems to me that it's not recorded, and there very well may be a purpose behind that. Now, look at chapter 3, verse 19. Here's where we're going to begin. Notice how the text is worded. My version says, I am sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go. I am sure of that. Seems to me that there are at least 2 or 3 possible ways to understand what he just said. One is, this is a statement from God about the nature or the character of Pharaoh. God says, I know him. He's not going to listen. I know him. Now, you and I do that to each other all the time because we go, I know that guy, he is not going to listen to you. I know if you talk to her, you're going to have problems. And from our perspective, that's what we say. But do we really know? In fact, that has been said, I'm sure, when someone went ahead against the warning of that person and found that it was not as bad as they had said. In fact, he did listen. In fact, she wasn't that way. And so when someone said, I know this is how it is, we don't know. But when God says, I know, we have to understand, God knows. So it may simply be God saying, here's who Pharaoh is. Number 2. We could interpret that this way. We could say, here is a promise from God. God says, I promise you, Moses, I'm going to harden his heart. I promise you he is not going to. It almost would be like God were saying, all right, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. And if he even tries to do it right, I'm going to stop him. Because I'm promising you it's not going to happen. Or how about third? Maybe this statement is God saying this. I have looked into the future. And in looking into the future, I have seen. And I know what his choices are going to be. I know what he is going to do. I know what he's going to say. I know how he's going to react. And for us to say that God is omniscient and knows everything first to last is an absolute fact about God. At least to this degree, I have to believe that God has the power and the ability to know it all. He does. In other words, I do believe that he has the power to look into the future and know everything that is going to happen. I have no problem with that. Now, just because he does, doesn't mean he has caused that to happen. Because God is outside of time. God is above it all, and he sees all that is and knows what's going to happen without causing it to happen. But I also must admit that it is possible to me that God has the power not to know the future. Can God say to himself, I'm not going to look. I'm going to turn my head. I'm not going to delve into that with my infinite knowledge. As a human, I have to believe, or I at least have to stand with the idea that if he has the power to know everything, he also has the power to choose not to know some things. So this could be a look into the future. And him being able to say, I know his reactions, I know what he's going to do, therefore, I know he will not let you go. Okay, that seems logical to me. Here's a third idea. How many of you, just out of curiosity, especially those of us who've been in the church all of our lives, some of you converted maybe this way, how many of you have seen the old Jewel Miller videos or film strips? Raise your hands high, I want to see. Yeah, wow. At least half of us have seen them. The other half of you need to see them. It's just fascinating. It's a look backwards into an old time. If they've not updated the people, they got 1970s garb on and everything. But if you remember the way they were portrayed, you learned. I learned because I went with my dad house to house showing those things. You know, there's the patriarchal age, the Mosaic age, and the Christian age, right? The Christian age we live in now, that's the new covenant. The patriarchal age was the age of the law of Moses, when God gave the law to Moses. The patriarchal age, preceding the Mosaic age, was when God spoke to heads of households and dealt with them directly. Do you remember the case earlier, or not earlier than this, but before the law of Moses? Do you remember the case with Abraham when he was married and he was going down to a heathen nation and he met Abimelech? And he was afraid. He went down there because of a famine. He was afraid that Abimelech, being a heathen people, would try to steal his beautiful wife. And so he said, why don't we conspire together and say, you're my sister? Well, in fact, she was related to him in that way. But of course, they were setting it up and saying, you just say you're my sister. And when Abimelech was told that, he said, well, I'd like to have her as my wife. So he took her. And then God dealt with Abimelech. And Abimelech came back and said, you shouldn't have done this. Abimelech in a heathen nation knew God. Here's my question. This is the patriarchal age. Is it the case? Is it the case that the Pharaoh knew God? Was God talking to him? Was God dealing with him? And he was not wanting God to deal with it? Maybe in the patriarchal age, the way God operated, it's possible that as he operated, if you said no long enough, he just quit talking to you. Maybe. So if you keep these things that are happening with Pharaoh in that patriarchal age, it becomes very interesting, it seems to me. Here's a fourth idea. Have you ever considered the fact that the plagues, the way they were done, were actually a representation of the mercy and patience of God? When God sent the children of Israel eventually into the promised land, how long did he wait before he destroyed Jericho? First city. Not long. They went and destroyed it. 7 days. What happened here? For a period of time, we don't know how long, but for a period of time, God was merciful and patient. He did this, and he did this, and he did this, and this, and this, and he kept dealing with them in ways that might turn them around. Were they willing to listen? Did the Pharaoh deserve any Patience. Remember, it's the patriarchal age. Theoretically, they already know some things or should have known some things. Why was God waiting? That's interesting to me. Well, it worked. His patience worked on some. You know, through the plagues, when he threw down his rod, Pharaoh's magicians did that too, didn't they? When he caused the water to turn to blood, Pharaoh's magicians did that too. When he brought the frogs out, Pharaoh's magicians did that too. Look at chapter 8. Look at chapter 8. In chapter 8, we learn something quite fascinating. Look at verse 19. When the lice came, the magician said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." Uh-oh, they were paying attention. But the very next phrase, Pharaoh hardened his heart. So it was working. It was working. In chapter 9, in verse 27, I believe it is, the servants of Pharaoh listened when God was going to bring the hail and brought their cattle in so they wouldn't be killed. The servants of Pharaoh. In fact, on another occasion, they actually said to Pharaoh, "Listen, he has destroyed our country. Why don't you let him go?" So the plagues actually represent God's merciful patience leading them to an understanding, potentially, that God is God. How about this one? Chapter 12, verse 12, and also in Numbers 33 and verse 4. God tells us why he brought the plagues. The plagues came in order to attack the gods of Egypt. I doubt that every single god that they had is represented in those plagues. There were probably others. But the gods or the plagues that were sent as a representation of your God can't stop this. Because one of their prime gods was the Nile god, the god of the river, because that was their economy. That's how they lived, the overflowing of the Nile River. And when he turned it to blood, they could go, "Whoa, what happened? How come our God can't stop that?" And when the frogs came out of the river, how come our God can't stop that? And so the plagues had a purpose. So remember, when God is working on this situation, God on purpose is saying, "I'm attacking what's going on here. I want to make a point." Here's what's next in the text. You know what? Nobody seems to be killed until, of course, at the end. Therefore, God, in doing what he did, was not causing death, if you will. Yes, he was destroying the land and houses maybe, and killed some animals, but there's no record that people died until the end came, of course, when the firstborn sons all died. So, though God is doing something, he's not damaging people, if you will, in the process. Here's another thing to remember. Remember this. When we look at the Pharaoh and we go, "Wow, I mean, he really put a whooping on them. Look at all those bad things he did." We're studying Job on Sunday morning, and this morning, we were talking about what was Job's physical appearance. And the way Job describes himself in the book reminds me, in the visual that we drew for ourselves, reminds me of the pictures that I saw, we've all seen, of the concentration camps camps in Germany and the bodies of the people there. That's how Job is presented in the book of Job. So while we might look at Pharaoh and go, boy, God is really causing some damage, remember, he did the same thing to Job. We don't have a problem, really, with God allowing that to happen to Job. So why should we have a problem with God allowing that to happen to unfaithful, God-denying people for the purpose of trying to teach them truth? So whatever we say about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, it's not anything different than what he's always done before. Because next, how many nations has God destroyed? How many nations? Nation after nation after nation, God has destroyed in Old Testament times, right? What was God doing here? He was destroying a nation. So when we talk about God hardening the heart, here's the deal. We don't really have a problem when God sent the children of Israel into the promised land and by sword, they just obliterated people. And we go, that's right, that's the plan of God, that's okay. But when God's plan does the exact same thing through the terminology of hardening Pharaoh's heart in order to accomplish it, we begin to have a problem and think God may be the problem. Well, how is God the problem here, but not the problem over there? How could God wipe out entire nations of people, cities of people, and not be a problem? And yet the way he deals with Egypt through these terminology of hardening the heart causes people problems to think that God is operating somehow unjustly and unrighteously. But he's already said, that's what the text said, read. Is God unjust? Is he unrighteous? Answer is no. So he can't have done anything wrong, or he would not be God. There's an interesting fact also that I forgot to mention. Did you notice in the text of the 9 plagues that came, not counting the 10th, of course, of the 9, only 2 of them did Pharaoh ask Moses to take away. Only 2. And on one of those, when he asked him to take it away, he said, Moses did, when do you want it gone? He said, tomorrow. Don't you think he should have said now? That would make sense. Now would be good. A couple of other times in the plagues, Pharaoh actually said to Moses, I have sinned. How did he know about sin? I think he knew about sin because we're in the patriarchal age. And at least there was a time in which he was talking with God and he had some knowledge, but he just set it aside and rejected it. But God's plan is clear. I want you to go to chapter 7 and verse 5. Chapter 7 and verse 5 begins the clear plan of God. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring out the children of Israel from among them. Look at chapter 8 and verse 22. In that day I will set apart the land of Goshen in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there, in order that you may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the land. In that day, well, that's the 4th plague. So the children of Israel experienced the plague of the lice, the frogs, and the water becoming blood. What? I thought these were plagues on the Egyptians. They were, but they were more than that. They were plagues meant to make a point and teach a lesson, even to God's people. Because see, they had been in Egyptian bondage for 400 years. And very likely they just didn't know God. And now God's having to show them, you need to know who I am. And so the first 3 plagues they experienced so that when they didn't experience them anymore, they could say, wow, this God who's taken us out of this dreadful place, he's a pretty powerful God. Look at chapter 9, verses 14, beginning. At this time I will send all my plagues to your very heart, on your servants and on your people, that you may know there is none like me in all the earth. Verse 16, for indeed for this purpose I have raised you up, that I may show my power in you, and that my name may be declared in all the earth. Go to the end of the story, chapter 14. When they have gotten to the Red Sea, they've made it there, and the Egyptians are following them, coming to get them. Verse 4 of chapter 14. Then I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will pursue them, and I will gain honor over Pharaoh and all of his army, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord. Well, okay, let's see if we can answer the question. It seems to me that when you understand the plan of God was to say to the Egyptians, I am God, your gods are not God. And God is going to take out this heathen nation. Whatever it means he does is no different than any other time he's ever done it. He takes them out as they need. But on this case, he was actually patient and merciful. And every time that Pharaoh said, okay, I'd like for you to take them away. What if God had not taken them away? Would he have changed his mind? In other words, Pharaoh kept changing his mind and hardening his heart because the magicians did what God did. Or because the plagues were taken away, and when they were taken away, he decided to be hardened in heart again. So God kept being merciful. After the first time, he could have just struck him dead, but he didn't do it. So he was merciful. Isn't that what it said in Romans chapter 9? So did God harden Pharaoh's heart? Absolutely. Absolutely he did. He did it through the process of the plagues. In other words, every time something happened, Pharaoh just got madder and madder. You know the point. You ever had to deal with a child who just would not listen? Never, right? And every time you do this, they just get further in it. They get more determined. I'm going to fight it. No, you're not going to handle me. It's not going to happen. And the more you do, the worse they get. Because they've set their mind. Pharaoh set his mind. And when his heart was revealed through the plagues, so that when God actually did reach out and harden his heart, he wasn't doing anything to take away the choices from Pharaoh. He was actually saying, okay, I've shown you. Here's who Pharaoh is. This is who he is. So I'm going to do fully what I'm going to do to him. Because I know he will not let you go. I know him. That's the way it is. Now, to make it applicable to us. If God was talking to them in the patriarchal age and he just kept rejecting, what about us? How long have you heard the truth and refused to act upon it? If you're not a child of God and you've heard 2, 3, 4, 15, or 5,000 times, if you're not a baptized believer, you're not in the family of God, and you keep rejecting it, can you get a hardened heart where one day you won't do it? Is that revealing who you really are, like the plagues revealed who Pharaoh was? Or how about when we decide we're going to live like we want to live, and I'm going to do what I want to do, and yes, I'm going to push right on through my conscience and go right on past it. How many times can you pass right by your conscience and push it aside without eventually getting to the point where your conscience just quits talking now? It's over. Like God may have quit talking to them. So the danger is, don't put yourself in a position to be hardened like the Pharaoh. So be right while you have a chance. Tonight is that chance. If we need to help you while we stand and sing.